I would like to introduce Tony Gosling, who is the former investigating journalist. Welcome, Tony.
Hi there. Yeah, well, I'm actually a former BBC journalist, and I was a researcher and a journalist for the BBC. As some of your listeners might remember, a station called Greater London Radio in the 1990s, and working with characters like Johnny Walker, Tommy Vance on that programme, which was very much what we were doing was cutting edge news, international and national, for London's listeners to the BBC. And so that's where I kind of learned how to do the job, which is to go out of my way to dig out sources, which very, very few journalists, most journalists are too lazy, let me be frank, to do this, to actually bother to dig, to find the truth. They're much, much happier to just allow the lies to come into their in tray, and then just to copy them and paste them into either a newspaper or into a bulletin. And you need to be actually quite active in order to find, the honest sources. So many people out there who are vying for our attention and who've got a financial interest in it, are being paid to force their voice onto the airwaves. And so that's what I learned working in Marylebone High Street in London near Baker Street. For the BBC, is to just make sure that the listeners have got the maybe quieter voice, the not so well financed voice, but the more authentic voice. For example, I was working there during the first Gulf War, and I managed there was a bit of controversy around the production office, and then in the newsroom. But I managed to get on a guy who'd done a biography of Saddam Hussein, which was quite a sympathetic biography. And he only lived around the corner from the radio station, so we got him into the studio. And there were a few raised eyebrows, like, how, we're supposed to be at war with Iraq. How can you have somebody on the radio who's sympathetic? Well, that to me is what a journalist's job is to make sure that the listeners, and the listeners always should come first, that the listeners have got all perspectives. And it's very, very tempting to go with the pressure that there is on editors, managers, etc., in the mass media, who we very rarely see these editors, we very rarely see these managers, in order to just simply push the national line, the national orthodoxy, the government line, the corporate line. And I always try to get voices on which will show that isn't the only perspective.
That is very correct. Thank you very much, Tony. You gave a very brief and articulated introduction of your work, especially the investigating work you have done so far. And I believe that a lot of listeners must have known you or recognized your work. However, Tony, I really extend my thanks to you to become the part of my show today. This show is significantly important today because I want you to address so many breaches, so many issues which currently faced by the majority of the European Muslims and Muslims across the world by the French government's stance on it, and the new Islamophobic wave has just drastically shaken all of the Muslims' hearts and sentiments. And really, we are deeply concerned. We're deeply hurt by the statements being made, by the stance being taken, by the way the Prime Minister, the President of France, Macron, took the hurtful stance and position in order to suppress the Muslims in France. Actually, I just give a couple of examples. I mean, they used the term of freedom of expression. I mean, this is one of the terms that already have been elaborated several times in the courts. And I will quote in our further discussions that according to law, how the freedom of expression has been already dealt and the apex courts of European Union, as well as the biggest European countries as well. They already have dealt this kind of the things, but I really don't know how the French President Macron took that kind of the stance and neglecting and ignoring the emotions, sentiments of a large religion of the world, 1.8 billion Muslims, sentiments and feelings. So what is your comments on that?
Well, there's so many aspects to this story, and I think if you're going to go into it, you need to take a step back from this one particular incident, because it fits into a pattern which has not just been going on since the 1980s. It's been going back actually many, many years. So there's the two main sides to this really are: what do you mean by freedom of expression? Does that include the right to ridicule, attack people's fundamental rights, values, that sort of thing? But the main thing, I think, is if you're looking at what you have a freedom to express, yes, there should be freedom of expression. I think very basic stuff, like, for example, there has been criticism of Israel has been classed as hate crime, and really spoken of as anti-Semitism. I think the main take home from this incident is, what if these cartoons in the French schools were ridiculing Jews? Would the attitude of the establishment, of Macron, etc., the media, be different? And I think from that, we need to just take like I say, a step back and look at the perspective of the laws of blasphemy over the centuries. Now, they've been diluted down. Liberalism has meant, and atheism, basically secularism, has meant that these are no longer thought by the law in most countries to matter. But I think they do matter. And I think if someone is coming in to attack somebody's faith, now that is to say, not just to criticize it in a respectful way, which I think is always acceptable. If you're taking examples from the faith and saying, well, this is a criticism of the faith, and there is for example, an apparent hypocrisy in the Bible, where the Bible on one hand is saying one thing and on the other hand is saying something different. This, I think, is good and it's healthy, and so that we should have those sorts of respectful debates about faith and religion, particularly the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But when it comes to simply mocking the faith, I think that we need to be actually applying the same rules to Islam and Christianity as we do to Judaism, because in France, the idea, for example, of Holocaust denial, you might argue for freedom of expression, but in France, it's a crime to deny the Holocaust. So that isn't really allowing freedom of expression. So the French have started with that aspect of Judaism to acknowledge that that freedom of expression does not include mocking other faiths and actually saying, well, the attack on that faith was not real, for example. So I think there is some justification for that. And of course, you should also be able to criticize with facts the aspects of the Holocaust. If you've got a fact which contradicts some of the official narrative, that's fine. It should be fine. But I think the idea of mocking these faiths is completely wrong. And we have had this for centuries. I mean, in many cases, in Britain, for example, or other parts of the world, but blasphemy was punishable by death. Back in medieval times, if someone was to say something against Christianity, they risked themselves being executed for it. So we don't, I think, want to go back to that. But we do need to understand that there are sacred things out there, and that if people want to criticize them, they need to do so in a respectful manner. So that's one aspect of this case. The other aspect is the basic assault on monotheistic faiths, particularly on Islam, that there's been over the last, well, I would suggest mainly the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, you just look at the attacks on the Arabic countries, the mainly Muslim countries, other Muslim countries like Pakistan, Iran. Iran now is seen, it's the actual Islamic Republic. they are seen as the main enemy by the United States, and there doesn't seem to be any actual real reason for that. There is, they are entitled to their place in the world just as anybody else, but there's been an absolute, not just a demonization of Islam, but there has been military attacks on Islamic countries and things like drone strikes now going on. Countries like Yemen, where there's a reasonable proportion of Islamic people there. This is the poorest country in the Middle East, and it's been under a sustained assault by Saudi Arabia for many years now, with something like 100,000, possibly 200,000 people killed. So these Islamic countries, many of them, I mean, I'm not saying Yemen is an Islamic country, it's just part of the mix there. But places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and particularly Iran have been targets from the US terrorists, etc., for a long, long time. So there is an attack not only on the faith itself in France, but there's a military attack on the whole idea of Islam. Now, what does this remind you of? It reminds me of the attack by the Nazis on the Jews back in the 1930s and 1940s, the genocide of Jewish people in Europe, in occupied Nazi Europe. And so I think we need to see this all in context, that there is a big, powerful force out there that is trying to undermine these faiths in all sorts of different ways, and trying to sensationalize what happened in France, also through the third real, I suppose, main aspect of this is the attack on Islam itself through these various intelligence agencies. So what we've seen is the British, through individuals, actually, we're going right back to the late 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, the turn of the century, around about 1900, or by the British Empire over in the Middle East, because the British were everywhere in those, interfering in all sorts of countries, redrawing lines as they did with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East. The British, what we were doing, I should say, in those days when we had an empire, was actually infiltrating various fake versions of these faiths in. So we saw, you could go right the way back to medieval times with the Knights Templar. These people were basically fake Christians that wanted to use Christianity as a cloak in order to come to the Middle East and plunder, to kill, to murder, to steal. But they tried to use the name of Christ and the idea of Christianity as a way to try and con people to thinking that they were Christians. Well, many of the terrible acts that the Templars did were well away from the scrutinizing eyes of people in Europe who were supporting them. They didn't know what was going on, but we do now. And we've seen since the 9/11 attacks an increasing use of these kind of proxy forces, these people like the Salafists, people like Al-Qaeda, people like ISIS, as a kind of fake version of the Islamic faith in order to basically demonize. And also, basically, these are just mercenary proxy armies that wave an Islamic style flag in order so that the Western media can point the finger all the time and say, this is Islam doing this, this is Islam doing this. Well, the fact is, anybody that actually knows Muslims, say here in the United Kingdom, knows that Muslims are not terrorists. They are actually some of the closest people in the world to the original monotheistic faiths. Things like the 10 commandments that from Moses, people that actually keep those commandments. I mean, I myself know quite a few people have been brought up here in Britain and in other countries like Canada who have looked at Judaism, they've looked at Christianity, and they've said, well, most of these institutionalized faiths are kind of not revealing the original teachings, things like supporting abortion, this kind of thing. And so they've turned to Islam as one of the closest faiths to the original, what the original Moses and the Jews intended in the Old Testament. And of course, Jesus too in his Sermon on the Mount, and what Muhammad said as well. These are very, very close to what one could call a good, close moral relationship with God. So those are the three aspects I'd just like to start with there of this specific incident in France with the beheading of the school teacher. I would suggest that was a deliberate, provocative incident, not done by an ordinary Muslim, but done by what are now dubbed as Islamists. That is to say, basically agents of the Western intelligence services who go in to do extreme acts, very questionable, but based on what is effectively a real grievance that many Muslims feel. So I think that's what we're looking at here, is probably some sort of provocation by the intelligence services. I don't know the exact incidents, but we've seen this time and time again. I mean, I've been looking, for example, very closely at the Manchester Arena attack, and it seems clear to me that the Western intelligence services were extremely close to Salman Abedi, the alleged bomber, and his family. His father was working for MI6 as part of the Libyan Islamic fighting group for many years, and he then disappeared off to, I think he's now in Turkey. But the closeness of the Western intelligence agencies who try and do these kind of sneaky proxy attacks, false flag attacks, this has all the hallmarks of that. I can't say for definite what happened. I don't think even the police in France know exactly what happened and who the real motivation was. But people can be encouraged to do these sorts of acts and fitted up for these sorts of acts. So there is a genuine sentiment there, but I think it's also quite feasible that the Western intelligence services, as we know, working very closely, by the way, with the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service. So when we talk about the Five Eyes, that is to say Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there's also a sixth eye. That is Israel, very much involved in the same intelligence networks. They're the signals intelligence agencies, the spying agencies that listen into the phone calls, the internet chat, and that sort of thing. So that, I think, is, in summary, is my view, is you've got these three different aspects. Firstly, as I just said, you've got the intelligence services and their proxy armies, and they are creating terror themselves. They've just, by the way, in Britain, granted themselves an act of parliament to allow themselves to completely break the law with no redress through the courts, which is literally a very important move towards tyranny here in Britain, that the intelligence services are above the law. Of course, they should never be above the law. They should be sticking to the law, or otherwise you're going to get a civil war or something turning out in Britain if you've got the intelligence agencies above the law. And then there's also the historic aspect of creating these fake faiths, as well as this whole idea of freedom of expression having its limits. One of those limits is I cannot, for example, now talk about encouraging a criminal act, and I should never do that. And in fact, that should be a limit on freedom of expression, as should, I believe, gratuitous mocking of people's faith. I think that also, that also should be one of the red lines for freedom of speech. Should never go beyond that. If you're going to criticize somebody's beliefs and their faith, you should do it in a respectful manner, except, I suppose, through satire sometimes is acceptable. If it's genuinely humorous, that's okay. But much of this is not. It's just mocking of the Islamic faith.
Thank you very much, Tony. Ladies and gentlemen, you have listened Tony's very detailed, classified comparison of different kind of the terrorist attacks, as well as the different events. And he covered, I think, the whole topic in very greatly mannered. I just wanted to summarize before we move on to United States elections about this topic. Ladies and gentlemen, the freedom of speech is not giving anyone's a permission to create the disorder within the community, within the peaceful public debates. Any hurtful speech and blasphemy is the serious and critical violation of the freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen. And also, if I extend that, as Tony mentioned very greatly within his comments, there is a double standard we see in the Western laws here, that the Holocaust, the denial of Holocaust is a serious violation of many countries, and also creates a lot of problems for a lot of people. And also the denial of violation, denial of Holocaust is not protected by any rights and any human rights. And they said that the denial of Holocaust is not covered by the freedom of speech. I refer here a few cases of the European Court of Justice. It is the first case is, I think, the Germany's top court, which held, it was in 2018, which held under the Article 5.1 of the basic law, which gives the rights of the freedom of speech. In the court ruled, and I quote, Holocaust denial breaches the limits of the peaceful public debate and presents a disruption of the public peace. And second, the court further said that the freedom of speech does not cover the Holocaust. And second, there is another court, which is the European Court of Human Rights. They held last year, 2019, in October. They said that the Holocaust denial is not human rights, wherein the person who appealed in the European Court of Human Rights, he appealed that he take the plea. He expressed his right of freedom of expression, which the court refused to accept it. And they said that the judges unanimously ruled that the accused pastors who brought a defense of freedom of speech, like the court said here, the defense manifestly ill-founded and had to be rejected, and such statement could not be attack the potential of the could not attract the potential of the freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen. So if I conclude the whole debate here, in the whole world, there is 1.8 billion Muslims who feels aggrieved by the publication and demonstration and spreading any kind of the mocking and messages or cartoons of our Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. If the 1.8 billion Muslims feels hurtful, why the law, the French law, the European law, is not considering their beliefs? Why the French law and the European law is not giving the importance of their faith and of their feelings and of their agreements on these things? And only,
well, I mean, all I'd say is if I can say, I mean, you know, it's what they're showing is that they're inconsistent. So they have a bias towards some specific faith, but not towards another faith. I'd also say, I mean, for example, back in the 1980s, I think it was late 1980s here, we had the release of a film called The Life of Brian by Monty Python, which some Christians believed, a very few actually, was mocking the life of Jesus Christ. It's actually, I mean, I assume myself, I'm a Quaker, a kind of traditional British Christian, not really part of the mainstream church. We're what they call non-conformist part of Christianity. And the most Christians thought it was a very entertaining film by Monty Python, and it was done in a way which was not actually mocking Christ himself. It was showing, for example, some individual who people thought was the Messiah, but he wasn't. So it was mistakes not by God or by Jesus, but by the public. You know, so they had made that big mistake, and they believed that Brian was actually Jesus, and while Jesus was kind of sidelined, people were following the wrong person. So it wasn't an attack on Christianity or Christ specifically, and it wasn't mocking them. It was mocking us, the public. And of course, that is very much, you know, in the faith. We have the whole situation with Pontius Pilate in the New Testament, where Barabbas, a criminal, is put up in front of the crowd, and the crowd choose. He's one of the zealots, you know, kind of direct activists of the Jewish people. And the crowd wants to pardon him. It doesn't want to pardon Jesus, even though Jesus is quite an important figure historically. Barabbas is almost forgotten now, but the crowd goes for Barabbas. a popular resistance figure in the New Testament times. And so what you can do is you can criticize, and you can make criticisms about the faith, and actually you can have an entertaining time doing that, as Monty Python showed back in the 1980s with The Life of Brian. But you should never, I don't think, you should never set out deliberately to mock anybody, except so maybe a powerful political figure. Yes, but not an object of people's faith. That, I think, is wrong, and it should come under exactly the same sort of legislation as Holocaust denial. And the problem with Holocaust denial is, what if you come across hard evidence that something that is part of the Holocaust is untrue? Are you saying that you're not allowed to discuss or debate that? Well, that, of course, is ridiculous, and it's showing up the hypocrisy of the European Court and these rules. Obviously, the court I've seen that very much here in Britain. So I'd just like to finish by saying, you cannot necessarily, this is an earthly court, a secular court. And at the end of the day, how can you rely on a decent attitude from the faith perspective from a secular court? Of course, we need to have our own forum to discuss these things.
But Tony, 1 second. When we say that we can criticize any religion, we must remind that we must do that in a respectful manner. We will not allow, and nobody is allowed to mock or any other kind of the criticism on any faith or belief on religions, which comes under the very disrespectful manners and which creates the panic situation within a peaceful community and society and the public, and which cannot be carried on as a peaceful debate anywhere. That is a quite standards if you want to have a peaceful debate on any religion's faith or any philosophy or any logics. There is no harm in that. But equally, if I go back to the incident what happened in France, we do denounce that what that man has did, who killed the teacher. We denounce him. We don't say that he did the right thing. We say he should not take the law in his hand. And there are so many ways to take a claim against such kind of the grievance in the court of law, and there is a way to make that. But unfortunately, the complaints have been made and was ignored. But I'm still, we no Muslims standing beside that man who beheaded the teacher. But I'm telling you that the French president, he is not denouncing at the same time equally to the teacher's act. Even the worst scenario is, and the worst situation is, what he is doing, he is accepting and adopting a very hard stance and very hard line in order to make a new law to suppress the Muslim communities and to suppress the people's faith. And on the other hand side, he is claiming that he is the country is secular, but he is not giving the rights, fundamental rights. These rights are protected rights. These rights are protected by the European Court of Justice. These rights are protected by the European Commission of Human Rights. And these rights are protected by the United Nations Universal Charter of Human Rights, 1950. All these rights are protected. Nobody is allowed to harm, and any law cannot be made wherein someone's basic practice of faith or belief can be disrupted and hurt, and people's feelings will go at a level where they come on roads, and instead of involved in their daily peaceful life, they come on road by protecting their rights in order to support their rights, and they are coming out holding a banners and chanting the slogans for the protection of their human rights campaign. We are saying that the same time the French president neglectedly and deliberately ignored the fundamental human rights, the basic rights, and he deliberately neglected and ignored the 1.8 billion Muslims' sentiments across the world, the faith of the Muslim sentiments across the world. He cannot express his own wishes and feelings that this is what he like, this is what he don't like. This is not how it works.
Yeah.
The personal wishes, personal life.
You have to also understand
He's the president.
that Macron is not Macron is
He's
not a popular president.
Yeah.
Macron is not a popular president. He's known around many cities in France as the imposter. If you see posters of Macron, you'll see the word imposteur next to him. You had, for the last 2.5 years, the yellow vest protests right across France, deliberately attacking Macron. He is a man who is from the bankster class. He was a former employee of the Rothschild Bank, and he has really not got the people's best interests at heart. He is one of these people who is put in place as an operator for the deep state. That is to say, the bankers, the deep state, the intelligence services, the bankers, and the corporate interests, including, by the way, a lot of top-level European aristocracy are part of the elite groups. So he's working for them. He's not working for the French people. So it's hardly surprising that he's using these divide and rule tactics within France.
Yeah, that's correct. And these are the double standards. If he's allowing a teacher to display a cartoons of 1.8 billion Muslims prophets, the beloved prophets, the people of Muslims, they love their prophets, and these actions hurts not only the Muslims but the 58 countries who are the member state of United Nations. The France is the permanent member of Security Council, whose primary duty and whose primary responsibility is to maintain the peace in the world. But this man, he is the head of the France, and he is the head of one of the veto member of United States, United Nations. He is seriously breaching his own primary duty, being the permanent member of Security Councils. And I must refer here one of the Security
That's
Council's
right. Yeah. So
one of the Security Council's own resolution. 1 second, Tony. I just wanted to give this reference of a resolution of Security Council of United Nations. It was 377A. It was passed in 1950 and adopted by the General Assembly of United Nations, wherein they have adopted and they have taken a rule that if a permanent member is trying to stop the General Assembly from doing any action which is against the peaceful society, the security of the people and the security of the world, and the peace is in danger, then this permanent member cannot come forward to veto any this kind of the resolutions. They denounced their play, and they said that we will intervene where a permanent member of Security Council is involved in breach of the peace of the world, and is he actually having the full responsibility to maintain the peace and discipline and security of the world. But unfortunately, this is such an irresponsible act. He must need to review and take that actions back. The speeches he made against the Islam, the speeches he made, one person's action cannot be related to the 1.8 billion Muslims. If that man beheaded a teacher,
this is, look, you hit on the main question here. This guy was not following the teaching of Islam. So whose teaching was he following? Right? This is the main question here. And we have looked very carefully here in Britain.
Muslims teaching. We are talking about the law, what the protected human rights. We're talking about the United Nations own Universal Declaration of Human Rights, European Commission Human Rights. I'm not talking about Islam. These are the principles set under the international laws, and these are the principles set under the European laws, that you are not allowed to hurt anyone's faith or belief. You are not allowed to make any law which restrict or suppress or control anyone's faith or belief. How can he breach his own laws, and how can he breach the laws of the United Nations, the European Commission of Human Rights? He breached the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. He breached the rulings of the European Courts of Justice. And I don't want to comment anything what the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan commented on him about his mental capacity or mental illness. I don't want to do that, but I don't want to go in there what is his mental capacity. But what I can see and what the world can see, that this man has a grudge, this man has a very hate, or politically or something like religiously inspired by such groups which actually triggered him to make such kind of a statement or come forward with a very hot or hateful stance against the Muslims within the France or across the world, ignoring all of the basic elements and facts. I don't think so that he can take the same stance against the Holocaust. I don't think so that he can allow the teachers to give any kind of the demonstrations in their syllabus or books about the Holocaust and saying that what is the version of the other parties which is not allowed to describe anywhere. So this is the double
Well, look,
standards.
he's working to an agenda. This is Macron I'm talking about. He's working to an agenda. That agenda, we have to take, again, a step back. What is that agenda? Because we've seen, for example, in the 2017 elections here in Britain, we saw 3 major terrorist attacks in the run-up to the election. One at Manchester, one at London Bridge, and one at Westminster Bridge. Now, all of those 3 attacks had very suspicious circumstances around them. The intelligence services had been informed of the individuals beforehand by the anti-terror hotline for each of the 3 main attackers in those supposed attackers anyway, in those attacks. And the idea is, this is certainly what I've come to the conclusion of, is certainly when there's an election in the offing, is that these attacks steer the public debate during the election period, so that the media is spending all of its time talking about how terrible Islamic terrorism is and how much tougher we need to be on Islam, not Islamism or the terrorist groups, but this is an attempt to smear Islam and to make it a big, big issue in the discussion before people go to vote at the polling stations. So we've seen that here. And the model of that really is back in 1995, back in Israel, where you had Netanyahu waiting in the wings, and the president of the day was actually making peace in Palestine. And what happened? The friend of Netanyahu's actually started doing an attack on the president and killed and shot the president dead, Perez, I believe. And so that was the discussion that dominated the election. And it turned out that actually it was one of Netanyahu's supporters that had killed the guy. You know, so the idea of using terrorism in order to kind of steer the public mind and steer the media debate is something that we really have to trace back, I think, to, I mean, it's happened maybe in the past before, but in the modern era, it goes back to the assassination of the peacemaking president in Israel and his replacement by Netanyahu and the war party, who are doing everything they can through every different means, it seems to me at the moment, to increase tension between Israel and Iran. And of course, Netanyahu's still around, even though he's one of the least popular people in Israel. And there are all sorts of attempts to get rid of him, big protests outside his house and that sort of thing, but he's clinging on to power. So I think this struggle in the Middle East, we've seen the Gulf states now going over to supporting Israel, even though we thought that they were Arab states, it now proves that they're not. They're actually Israeli supporting states like the UAE, for example, Bahrain, these kind of countries. And so I think that we're in danger, and we're moving maybe towards talking about the presidential election now, of what they call in the intelligence services, hardening the sides towards people are going to be either supporting Israel or Iran in the Middle East, and there's not going to be a lot of choice about which side you're on. The idea is to force each individual, each nation, to choose a side in what is a potential coming war. And that is the one policy that Joe Biden and Donald Trump don't seem to want to talk about in the debates, is foreign policy. I mean, this was a key thing for the rest of the world, watching what's going on in America. We all want to know what's going to be your foreign policy. Anyway, they've massively diluted the discussion in the presidential. There was no discussion in the first presidential debate, and only very minimal, trivial discussion discussion in the second debate. So promises from Donald Trump or Joe Biden about not starting another war in the Middle East, which I think is a very significant aspect to the presidential race at the moment.
Yeah, and also, Tony, in the Middle East, the trade agreements, and also in Syria, the Donald Trump is more interested. However, we see in the debate, he was diverting the topics towards the other things instead of giving the main focus lines, which should have been discussed there. He failed to address the COVID-19 situations. More than 220,000 people have died, and they said that nearly 200,000 people could be died by the end of this year, and still then there is no vaccination is ready. On top of that, there is also he made some allegation about the Joe Biden about his son's business interests in China. And what is your comment on that? How it will affect? And also, I want your comments on the possible voting by postal voting and possible frauds or rigging the elections by postal voting.
Well, look, I mean, I think that the postal voting systems all around the world need to be closely looked at, because this is an obvious way of, I mean, we had it in East London a few years ago, a massive controversy about postal votes basically being fraudulently sent in. So that needs to be scrutinized in the same way that the actual voting ballots are scrutinized by candidates. The way we do it, you know, you've got a big hall as the count takes place, everyone can see who's a candidate, those votes for them and against them being counted. You can stand and watch it. You can't do that with the postal votes, so there needs to be a proper system for that. But in the United States, I'm also interested in the polling, because Biden is polling higher than Trump. Now, remember, if you go back 4 years ago to Hillary Clinton, she was polling higher. So I'm quite concerned about the polls, because there's a significant proportion of people who basically just kind of almost like sheep will go with the flow. So if they think that somebody is more popular, is gaining support amongst the public, then they will vote that way. So they don't really want to think too much about all the issues. They just want to vote for the person who they think other people who've looked at the problems are going that way. So the polls are quite significant in that way. We saw obviously with Brexit too, the polls were completely wrong on that. So I wonder whether the polls are wrong again, because what the polls can do, and remember, we cannot go and check these polls. All we have to do is trust them. You know, we have to trust the pollsters. And who controls the pollsters? Who owns the pollsters? To a large extent, it's mainstream media companies, the same people who are feeding us a biased version of what the various candidates are saying. They're burying stories, like they've, you know, you just made reference, I think, to Hunter Biden, you know, the story there, which has been being suppressed in the United States, to do with his alleged laptop and all the emails, and even, you know, very unacceptable images potentially found on those laptops. This has been very much suppressed in the United States, as have basic things with the pandemic. Like one of the chief White House people put out a statement saying that he was totally unconvinced by arguments that masks were good for your health. This was censored, not only by the mainstream press, but also by social media. So we know that the mass media likes to try and steer the public in a certain direction. They often own and control these polling companies. So I think the same with the polling companies. When it comes to an important election like that in the United States, I don't honestly trust the polls very much at all. On smaller issues, on single issues, maybe the polls are honest, but on the big issues, they want to be able to flex their muscles and control and steer the debate, and they can do that by having a few percentage points one way or the other way that they've steered it. Also, of course, the samples that they use, the specific individuals, is up to the polling company. They may choose, you know, a non-representative sample of people in order to poll. So sometimes, you know, I just think we've got to be very, very careful with these polls. But on the foreign policy, the main point on the foreign policy debate is that if you're not talking about foreign policy, that doesn't preclude a coming war. And we're seeing all the signs in the Middle East that we're the hardening of the sides between Iran and Israel, and countries are almost having to come out one way or the other. It seems to me, particularly with the political stalemate and the lack of democracy in Israel, that the war party in Israel is looking to this as their opportunity to get a war started. And if that happens, what we've got is we've already got the Russians in Syria in the region. The United States obviously would come immediately to the aid of Israel, and we would have a US-Russia confrontation. Then the Chinese have a very, very strong interest too, and they are very much supporters of the Palestinian capital being in East Jerusalem. So with the Chinese later getting involved in such a war, we have a very dangerous scenario on our hands. So I think it's absolutely crucial that the candidates in the US election absolutely lay it on the line what their position is on this kind of potential war on the horizon.
Thank you so much, Tony, for your great input in relation to the US elections. And I'm sure that the audience will have enjoyed and learned a lot of things. This is the end of our show, and my manager continuously waving his hand. We definitely will have another show again on few other crucial issues, and possibly on the United States elections again. So thank you very much for Tony for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our show, and hopefully we'll see you again next week with a new topic. Thank you very much.
The new NHS COVID-19